Eastshade at its best is a refreshingly different and gorgeous adventure game. Eastshade at its worst was messy, unpolished, and boring. The premise drew me in immediately, an open-world adventure game where you travel around painting instead of killing. You could describe it being an Elder Scrolls title without any enemies. There's no combat, the focus is on helping others and exploring the island. Looking at the Steam tags, the marketing material, and reviews, Eastshade seemed like it would be a perfect fit for me. I don't need to have a combat system to enjoy my time, and exploring is my favorite aspect in a lot of games. There were times where I was loving Eastshade, but the more I thought about it, the more I came to the realization that I wasn't enjoying what Eastshade was, but rather what it was trying to be. The ambition of the premise was always on my mind, tricking me into thinking the mundane task I was doing was actually fun. If you're still interested in Eastshade and want to back out of the video to avoid spoilers, I have to warn you, painting isn't as big of a focus as the marketing portrays. The world is built around finding pretty vistas to paint, but the vast majority of your time will be walking back and forth doing tasks for NPCs. At times it felt like a walking simulator. Your movement is slow and there's not much to do besides turn the camera. I think this game could appeal to a lot of people, so if you're fine with having a slower paced, relaxing experience, this might be right up your alley. With that in mind, let's get started. A quick rundown before I begin. Your mother passed away, seemingly recently. She always talked about how much she enjoyed visiting the island of Eastshade and urged you to travel there sometime in the future for inspiration for your paintings. She had 4 favorite places on the island, and your main goal of the game is to find those 4 and paint them. The ship you're on takes you near Lindau, a small town near the coast. There are 2 cities on the island, the smaller, more humble coast town of Lindau, and the grander central city of Nava. The island of Eastshade overall lacks any sort of violence, which means your only potential danger from venturing out into the unknown is freezing to death at night without tea or a coat. There really isn't an explicit story or narrative in Eastshade. There are quests that need to be done to see the end credits, but all of them are left ambiguous on whether completing them will be necessary. Instead, you're free to explore all around, meet new people, help them with their problems, and paint anything you find that catches your eye. Sometimes you'll trade your paintings to request a favor of the person afterwards, access certain knowledge, or maybe for glowstones, the currency of the world. To be able to paint anything, you need to have enough inspiration, the number at the bottom right. That number corresponds to how many times you can paint. To increase your inspiration level, you need to explore new locations, read new books, try new foods, have new experiences. There's also a crafting system, which is what you'll be using to create your canvases to paint with. There are some fundamental problems with the world and core mechanics that made me less invested as I went along, but before I get to those subjective qualities, let's talk about some of the more objective ones first. Eastshade is made by a pretty small development team. When a smaller studio develops a 3D video game with semi-realistic looking graphics, you expect a few hiccups along the way. I'd say the game looks good, but it only manages to look great when staring at the vistas it expects you to paint. Standing still or walking perfectly straight doesn't seem to show problems, but turning the camera definitely does. I can see this giving people a headache. It's so stuttery and choppy. With how often you travel through the island back and forth figuring things out, you'll be spending a lot of time turning the camera, so it happens fairly often. I was able to get used to it, but I don't know if everyone else would be as fortunate. There are also pop-in related issues that happen periodically. For a different kind of game, I could understand basic draw distance issues for objects far away, but for regular assets and lighting, it's hard to overlook. This wouldn't be a huge deal, but Eastshade is supposed to be about finding the beauty of the island and its scenery to paint. There's even an export paintings feature, so they were definitely under the impression that players would want to paint things for themselves. I don't think I can blame Eastshade Studios for this too much, as this type of experience would really only work in 3D. 2D games are definitely more suited for a small development team if pretty visuals are a high priority, but choosing an area to paint when scrolling through a 2-dimensional world just wouldn't be as satisfying. That being said, it was their decision to take the art style in a realistic direction. It's more jarring seeing a dock pop in and out with the realistic art style than any other, as I'm supposed to be tricking my brain into thinking this environment imitates real life. Ignoring the pop-ins and frame rate dips, the lighting can look very good, and I appreciate that when you're in dark areas it is hard to see. However, character models are basically impossible to see in the dark. When I was doing a quest to find someone in a tower, he told me he isolated himself here because of how grotesque his face looked. Maybe this was intentional, as the only way to have this conversation is to come here at night, but if the reason he alienated himself was because of his appearance, you'd think they would want the player to see it. Even when it's daytime out, if the character you're talking to has the light source behind them, you can't make out their face at all. I'm still undecided on whether this was good attention to detail or just annoying. There were times where birds would just hover in midair while flapping their wings. I'm no expert on birds, but I don't think this is right. The last issue I had was the worst of all, crashes. I haven't had a crash on me as much as other people, it seems, but it did happen twice to me in the same specific spot. Tiffmore Bluffs near the ruins, the same exact way. Thankfully, the second time I knew to save frequently before it happened. I can't imagine how horrible it must feel for people who lost hours of progress if they happen to not save in a very long time, especially since the majority of your playtime will simply be walking across the island doing nothing. My heart skipped a beat when my first crash happened, as I was in a very long play session, walked very long distances, and did a lot of quests that I didn't want to do again. The thought of having to make another bloat raft to slowly paddle along the water to get to the inn where I would have to do the mystery whodunit quest all over again sent me into a mild panic. For a brief moment, I thought to myself, well, looks like I'm not finishing this game. Thankfully, it had autosaved after I did the quest with the fish, so I wasn't too upset. My other complaints are far more subjective, and there are a lot of them, but I want to talk about the positives before I get to that. One thing that is very easy to praise, and is something I kept thinking about as I played, is the ambition of the game. Usually a smaller development team will tackle some 2D projects as they're much easier to get down, but creating a fully 3D open world for you to explore all around in was quite the task, especially when you consider that the game houses unique lore and creatures to create a distinct and unique world. Encountering some bears and deers instead of regular humans, or even dwarves and elves for that matter, was quite the surprise. The developers have gone on to say that they regretted using animal folk instead of regular humans, as it was off-putting for a lot of players. They even suspect they may have lost some sales because of it. I respect them for openly owning up to a perceived mistake, and I do agree that the creatures' body shapes and features could have been stylized more to fit their animal faces, but I still think I prefer how they are now to average-looking humans. The locales you visit don't feel alien to me, it just felt like nature, which is good. Exploring a version of nature that is somewhat familiar instead of peculiar was relaxing in a way. The only perceived oddity is the giant tree, which was a welcome sight. This is why I liked the anthropomorphic animals, as while I could still be at peace knowing that I'm in familiar territory, I still felt like I was in a different world other than my own. It felt like I was in a dream. I'll always remember walking out of that first room on the ship. You're getting your bearings together, hopefully have the settings you prefer, unpause and see a deer sitting at the table reading a book. A monkey then asks you your name. I was bewildered, but it intrigued me enough to care what they were saying. Every character you talk to, for the most part, is voice acted, which is a lot of work and a huge risk. Voice acting, of course, isn't cheap, and it could actually take you out of the experience if the lines aren't delivered well. There's also the issue with translation. They translated the game into 4 separate languages other than English. It's commendable that they went through the effort to voice everything, as there is quite a lot of dialogue in the game. I'm kind of split on if the voice work itself is good. I can't say any of them pop out to me as being amazing or awful. They're pretty good. Pretty good is a lot better than I expected it to be, however. I am incredibly impressed that I never heard the same voice twice. Maybe I'm not good at listening for that sort of thing, but I definitely know when voice lines sound phoned in. Every time someone spoke to me, it did feel like they were talking to my character and not just out loud with you overhearing. If I had to pick a favorite, it would be the Sheriff Bear or the Jarhead guy.
Well, I guess it was convenient that you dropped in when you did. Thanks for getting Nika.
Actually, he hasn't hurt a fly until now. You're the first person he ever got physical with, and seeing as you were in his house, as far as I gather without invitation, I'm not going to be so quick to call him dangerous. Like I said, we have it handled.
Even though at times Eastshade feels like a walking simulator akin to Everybody's Gone to the Rapture or Dear Esther, Eastshade at least attempts to pick up the slack in other areas. The quests give you some direction, and there's a sense of freedom that was exciting in the first couple of hours. There's a trust in the player that they will want to explore the world not to find enemies to fight or story to uncover, but people to help and landscapes to paint. The world seems like it was built to be extraordinarily pretty, it's kind of tough to find areas that wouldn't make a good painting. You could stop walking nearly any moment and have a gorgeous background for your computer. As I've mentioned, there is a function to export your paintings, and the game encourages you to hold on to your favorites. Even though I never felt attached enough to my paintings to do so, I at least respected that Eastshade wasn't solely using paintings as a stand-in for a trading commodity or quest item. Painting something because you liked it, not because the game was telling you to, is liberating in a sense. The painting does have its downsides though, which we'll get to later on. The inspiration system, while a little simplistic, cleverly drives players to try new things and visit new locations. It matches the "variety is the spice of life" mantra and the idea that we are shaped by our environment. I personally prescribe to that ideology, and seeing it used as a mechanic was enlightening. My personal bias aside, trying new things in life has always been viewed in a positive light, but the inspiration system makes sense for the simple reason that everything that has ever been created was made from a person who drew on their environment and personal feelings. Anytime you work on a project, whether it be a poem, a drawing, or a film, you are bringing your experiences into the creative process to shape it in your own way. The game, of course, picks and chooses which activities or encounters go towards your inspiration level, increasing the number that represents how many paintings you're allowed to paint. Like I said, it is a bit too simplistic, and you could argue it's just a stand-in for regular experience points for leveling up like any other RPG, but the window dressing of this system was so well done in regards to fitting the theme that it's worth accepting it at face value. I'm not sure I totally agree with the act of working on a farm reducing inspiration level, however. This is tying into the old adage of all work and no play, but if someone has never done any farm work in their lives, surely doing some farm work would be beneficial. It's a new experience regardless of it being work, it could broaden their horizons on food production, and they could gain some insight on nature itself. I certainly understand what they were trying to do with this, but I don't think it really says or adds anything worthwhile. What was worthwhile was the inclusion of fishing. I've mentioned before that I love to fish in video games. I even made a video dedicated to the topic. Surprisingly, the fishing minigame was the gameplay feature that had the most depth to it. I would have figured a game which requires very little skill on a moment-to-moment basis, such as Eastshade, would handle its fishing in a very boring way, like pressing a button to catch the fish. Instead, you cast your line out. Once you get a bite, reel it back in. It has a color-coded tension system, white, yellow, and red. Continuing to reel in the fish when the color is red means you lose the fish and the bait you used, so you need to let off every now and then. I think it's kind of ironic that fishing, an activity mostly seen as a relaxing break in most games, is the only activity in Eastshade that tests your skills on a mechanical level. It's definitely not very complicated or reaction-heavy, it just feels like it is when compared to the rest of the game. Certain fish require certain bait, and they only show up in certain areas like rivers or lakes. When you're at the right spot, you can even see the school of fish as you throw out your line, so it's not some guessing game. Knowing which fish are in what location can be found in a book available to purchase in Nava. One way in which the island felt like a real place was with its library and use of books in general. Reading any sort of passage that was new to you gave you some inspiration, but it was the other benefits that interested me. Reading about an old architect gives you a topic to talk about with the townsfolk, which you can use to gather information and track the architect down. Reading about where certain fish are located, of course, helps you with the quest line regarding fishing. At one point, you research what a water fox eats so you can bait one properly. Even though I find it kind of weird that I could plop into anyone's home and begin reading their personal notes and books, seeing the note from the park ranger's friend was kind of nice. What's important about this is the implementation of knowledge didn't function as a piece of the puzzle. Clicking the prompt to read the book so your character can now do a specific task they couldn't do before isn't what's happening. Instead, you, the player, are using these books as a reference. If you never went to the library, you could still bait the water fox trap. If you didn't have the book about the fish, you could still find them on your own. The only one of my examples where the knowledge from the book acts as a key is the architect quest, which makes sense, as to ask about the architect when you speak to the man bringing boxes into the tower, you need to know the architect exists in the first place. The game has a lot of quests, and there were a few of them I enjoyed. One of the first ones you're likely to encounter is in Lindau, where you find a man with his head stuck in a jar. This quest is one of my absolute favorites for two main reasons. One, seeing a guy with his head stuck in a jar was hilarious to me. His voice lines are very cheeky.
It's stuck, obviously.
and hearing how many times this has happened from the innkeeper just makes you wonder.
Again? That's like the 8th time.
2, if you pick your dialogue choices correctly, it could turn into something even funnier, and to be honest, kind of sincere. This woman wants to gossip with you about the man in a jar. She says he isn't a good father to his son, and I should report it to the sheriff in Nava. If you agree, you could instead go back in and tell him what she said. He gets really mad and kicks you out. If you stay and claim he's an unfit parent, he knocks you out cold. You wake up on the ground outside the house with the sheriff there. He questions you and then warns you that if you ever encounter a situation with an unfit parent, to never confront them, always report them. For a quest that started off so ridiculous, I was kind of shocked how they transitioned it into feeling like a genuine moment learning from the sheriff. The voice acting for the sheriff is great as well, so it makes it all the better.
We've got it handled. Like I said, you two just stay out of each other's way.
For the Wounded Water Fox quest, you need to bait the trap with something the Water Fox likes. You don't know what they like, neither does the Park Ranger Bear, so he recommends you go to the library in Nava. When you do, there's a book in there that says they eat eggs, so you go back, bait the trap with an egg, and capture it. Like I said, using the library as a genuine source of information is a great feeling. There's a quest where a woman makes bird calls at you and wants you to find the bird that makes the noise and paint it for her. The correct answer was an owl. I hadn't seen or looked for owls before, so it was kind of nice to keep my eyes and ears open for it. I ended up finding one by hearing the call before actually seeing it, which was a cool feeling. There's a much more complicated quest when you arrive at Sinkwood Inn. There was a stolen item and everyone is a suspect. You play the part of detective, searching everyone's rooms and finding clues. Eventually the real detective shows up and you submit your final answer on who you think the thief was. If you get it right, you get 40 glowstones.
Let me have a look around and see. Well, you might make a fine detective. Turns out it was actually Helena.
There's a certain quest where you need to catch a certain type of fish. I've already explained that I like the fishing mechanics in the game, but having to start from normal bait to catch small fish to catch medium fish, and finally the medium fish to catch the rare fish was a fun progression. It's also nice that you needed to sail out in deep water to find them. There's one more that I kind of liked, as you needed to use the library again. You hear rumors of noises at night that sound like drumming. You search around in the woods and you find some small creatures drumming around. They go away into their trees. You ask around, you find a library book about them, also finding a note from one of the creatures that saw you. He meets you at midnight, asks for you to paint Nava's skyline since he is rarely ever on the surface, and takes you into the underground where they live. You get to look around, maybe paint the place if you wanted to. It isn't amazing, but it does expand the lore of the island in an interesting way. Now that we have briefly gone over the positives, we'll end with more negatives. We've already established what the game's ambition was and how much I was in love with that idea, but its execution falls short on many fronts. The developer talked about wanting to give the player a sense of place. I think they accomplished that when standing still, looking at the scenery, but to me, feeling a sense of place doesn't stop with the environmental design. Artificiality in game worlds is an unfortunate concession we have to make given the nature of how much work it takes to make a video game, but for me it's a bit harder to maintain my suspension of disbelief when the game is attempting to feel realistic with its graphics. In Eastshade it's even less forgivable because there isn't any combat system to engage with, the gameplay isn't deep in any way, there's nothing to do besides enjoy your surroundings and the inhabitants of the island. This means to really give the player an enjoyable experience, they have to excel at their one objective, making the world feel believable, which it didn't at all. I've already mentioned the birds hovering in midair. This could have just been a minor glitch, as I have seen birds flying normally, so I won't count that one. You need to pay the toll to cross the bridge into the next area after Lindau, but there's nothing but an invisible wall to stop you from crossing. I think this being a toll bridge in the first place is ridiculous, as someone could easily walk through the river or use a raft to cross anyway. Even taking it at face value, there's still the issue with the invisible wall. For the bridge into Nava, there's a gatekeeper present that prevents entry. Why not put a gatekeeper at this one as well? Stuffing a specific amount of money into a box for an invisible barrier to go away is contrived in the first place, which could also be solved by giving that money to a gatekeeper instead. Every NPC in the game is voice acted, but after a while, once their sole purpose in life, interacting with the player, is completed, they regurgitate the same dialogue lines over and over. Now, I understand that NPCs in video games literally exist to interact with the player, but a responsibility of the developer is meeting the player halfway. I'm willing to suspend my disbelief to a point, but when I hear this line throughout the entire game, even though weeks have passed since I helped him with the jar,
Well, I guess
Well,
it was convenient.
I guess
that
it
you
was
dropped
convenient
in.
that
I
you
guess it
dropped
was
in.
convenient.
I guess it was convenient that you dropped in when you did.
Thanks for getting Nika.
I can no longer lie to my brain about what's going on. This is a stage prop that has served its function and may as well be removed from the game at this point. Him vanishing after I leave, never to be seen from again, would make more sense than him saying the same lines over and over in the same location.
Thanks for getting Nika.
Even worse is what happens with this lady in the house across from him. Early on in the game, she gives you soap and asks you if you want to hear gossip about the neighbor with his head in the jar. I said no on my first playthrough and moved on. She then stands there the entire game looking at the wall. The entire game. She says nothing else to the player, her only function was to gossip. Again, may as well have removed her from the game. Now, I completely understand how difficult it would be to give all of them complex dialogue options that expand over time, or routines to do during the day, but this is so eerily out of place that it actually frightened me a bit. I was genuinely unnerved, like she was hatching some evil scheme. There are plenty of times in the game where you don't know how to proceed with a quest, and the solution is to talk to someone on the island. For example, when you need to get 3 references to enter the city of Nava, you have to talk to characters you've already helped and ask them if they can write you a reference. The game encourages the player to talk to NPCs they've already talked to. Coming back to this town, attempting to talk to these characters and seeing them be cardboard cutouts was bound to happen. At the very least, dialogue topics about references and the town they live in should have been included for these two. Another example are these bears. You help one of them play a prank on his brother with a grape-flavored pastry. You listen to them as the prank happens. Then, anytime you come by throughout the rest of the game, these bears will be sitting at this table. When you talk to them, they will always talk about the grape-flavored pastry. That's their sole purpose in this world. You can't ask them what they know about the roots, or the town, or anything, even though you did them a favor, so it would make sense for you to be asking them questions instead of some random citizen of the town. NPCs having multiple topics to talk about wouldn't be enough on its own, though. There are some NPCs that have those, but are bewildering in a different way. This bear here is the park ranger clearing out a trail. That's all fine and good, but he stays in this one spot the entire game, night and day, working on this 1 square foot location. The only time he leaves is when you complete the Water Fox quest. After that, it's back to working on that one trail. I have an idea of how this character could have been better handled. There's a heavy emphasis on not picking up the endangered plant of the island. There are signs posted all over about not picking them up, and one bear's reputation was ruined over the accusation that he used them in his potions. It's clearly a big deal to this island, however, you picking them up doesn't do anything. Even when the lady tricks you into confessing that you illegally picked the flowers, there are no consequences. There's nothing to deter anyone from mindlessly grabbing every plant they see. I think the bear could have made this a bit more interesting. I understand that programming this sort of thing would have been difficult, but it would have helped the world give you that sense of place that they were going for. Instead of him standing there night and day pretending to work on clearing a path, why not have him patrol a radius around the big tree, keeping watch over everything? Picking the endangered plant within a certain distance of him prompts him to walk over, he confiscates the plant, asks why you took it in the first place, and finds you some glowstones. This would solve both the issue of him slaving away night and day inexplicably, and would give the impression that this world is cared for by active participants instead of signage and fake warnings. Another really weird NPC is this bear who appears to be an odd merchant. I'll talk more about him soon, but for now, just know that there's a quest where you figure out a password to a secret club you tell to the bear in exchange for an item he has which you need to progress through the game. Instead of using the password or even changing his dialogue thanking the player for the password, he repeats his entire spiel about the sealant. It's as if you've never talked to him before. He literally asks the player to get him the password again. All I could think during this moment was, how on earth did the developers think this made sense? Did they not think players would talk to NPCs ever again? There's one more dialogue issue that bugged me. Anytime you end a conversation with the characters, they say the same line regardless of the situation or context. Being told to watch out for the plants as you're walking makes sense when he's gardening.
Mind the plants underfoot!
Not so much when he's in bed sleeping.
Mind the plants underfoot!
I'm actually shocked that these two characters have a set time to be in bed, to be honest. There's truthfully a lot more I could point out that ruins my suspension of disbelief, but I think all of my examples here were enough. If you think I'm being nitpicky here, I think you're missing the point. Other video games have different ways to engage the player on a moment-to-moment basis, whether it be combat, strategy, story, multiplayer components, puzzles. Eastshade has none of that, besides maybe one or two puzzles, if you can even call them that. The vast chunk of your time playing will be walking and talking, exploring and interacting, seeing and hearing. If that part of the game is lackluster, what else is there? It certainly isn't painting, as that's barely utilized in an interesting way. I've mentioned that I like the inspiration system, and I do, but the painting itself is picking a spot to paint, clicking a button, done. There's nothing to it. And I don't mean it's too easy either. I mean, there's literally nothing here. You press a button. You might spend more time simply trying to find the materials to paint than actually painting. I'm not sure if a minigame of sorts would have been suited for the painting, but surely something, right? Some sort of decision besides picking where your camera is facing and magically making it appear on canvas. Building your premise around painting, then reducing it to pointing your camera somewhere and pressing a button feels so wrong. What would change if the main character was instead a photographer? Taking pictures is a lot easier than painting a landscape, but Eastshade thinks they're both as easy as pressing a button. It's actually worse than that, as taking pictures in real life has more complexity than in Eastshade as well, as you have plenty of filters, lenses, and settings to pick from. So even though the gameplay of painting is dumbed down to you basically taking a picture, it's less complex than the photo modes found in most AAA titles today. If the world and painting mechanics don't excel, then the brunt of the work needs to come from the quests, right? The quests in Eastshade could be viewed as one of the only things to do. Besides walking around exploring on your own or fishing for fun, you'll be running around doing quests for people. I've mentioned the few that I did like, but overall the quests don't manage to be as detailed or interesting enough to warrant the effort of even including their in-game text to the player. Bring a book to the lady on the boat. That's the tutorial quest, so fair enough. Talk to a guy at the inn, paint him for money. That's it. Talk to a guy sitting next to a tree, bring him 3 feathers. Talk to a guy at a bridge, paint him a gazebo. Talk to a girl at a different inn, bring her 4 inky caps. The Architect of Lindau is a perfect example of how deflating these quests can feel. You start off by reading a book in the inn describing how he built the town a long time ago, but he was never seen from again. You ask around town about him, but no one has heard or seen him. You learn about the tower to the south of Lindau, and the location of what's known as Old Lindau. This is where the city used to be, but a storm came through long ago and destroyed it, prompting them to rebuild further in from the coast. There are rumors that a ghost lives in the tower, which would make sense as it's so close to the old abandoned town. This sparked interest in me, but what I just described is the majority of the questline, learning of the lore. If you go to the tower at night, you can find someone bringing boxes to the tower. If you know about the architect, you call him out on it, and he lets you in. You meet the architect, tell him the people of the town see him as a great visionary instead of a hideous face, and he agrees to come back to town. He says he will leave this island forever, but wants you to paint Lindau for him to hold as a keepsake. Once you do, he leaves, and that's it. I guess I'm not sure what I expected, but something a little more than this. I was hoping talking to him was the start of something more significant, but instead it was the talking to him which was supposed to be the significant part. The progression of the game is unfortunately tied to a few of these quests, even if the player might not know it. To be able to cross the river into the Tifmore region, you need to have a bloat raft. To get the bloat raft, you need to talk to this fellow. He will gladly share the schematics on how to make it, but you need sealant. There's only one way to get sealant, and that's by talking with this bear here. He will trade it for you for 500 glowstones. Obviously, that's beyond reasonable limits. I'm not saying it's not possible, but doing the commission paintings that are available to you would need to be done in addition to farming and selling however many feathers for this chap to make the extra. Or you could endlessly farm random items like roots to sell for the bear for 1 glowstone at a time. No, the game doesn't expect you to go that route. The other way to obtain it is by trading the bear something in return. He wants to find out the password to the Roots secret club. There really is no way of knowing where you would find the password, all besides this chap here. He lost his amulet somewhere nearby. He mentions he is in the Roots and they meet on the beach on occasion. I figured that meant you could come back at midnight and find them meeting and talk to them, but nope, he is still standing here looking for his lost amulet. You don't know it yet, but that amulet is the key to getting into that club, so you need to find it to trade to the bear for the sealant. The only way to find the amulet is by using a special tonic near the ocean. The only way to obtain this potion is to solve Mudwillow's riddle, which has you painting the eclipse over the statue half circle. The only way to find Mudwillow herself is to find this statue, place the mirrors in a specific way, and drop through a trapdoor. Again, all of this is necessary to finish the game. The only way to get 2 of the 4 mother paintings is by traveling to the Tifmore region. It gets more ridiculous when you take a step back and look at all the quests you need to finish to get to the top of the tower to paint one of your mother's painting locations. A raft from Bloomsack has you befriend Bohan to learn the bloat raft, and paint Owner the beach to learn how to make twine, an essential ingredient to the raft. Admission to Nava, which is just you getting 3 references to enter the city.
I will not write you a reference. We already have too many vagrants in Nava for my taste.
Okay, a simple wrong would have done just fine, but
Mudwillow's riddle, where you need to enter her underground home and solve her painting riddle for the potion. An exclusive club, which is you finding the amulet with the potion and learning of the password to the Roots. Sealant, which is you doing the previous quest and giving him the password in return for the sealant. It's unclear to me if the Thief of Sinkwood Inn is required. It grants you the Reed Raft, but I don't know if it's necessary to cross into Tifmore Bluffs. I won't count it, but it's most likely something you'll be doing. After this, you'll most likely end up in the Tifmore region where 3 of the 5 hot springs are for a future quest, and where 1 of the mother paintings are. The top of Nava has you attempting to go to the top of the tower for a mother painting, but being stopped by a guard. Only people with a pass can go up, and only people from the university give them out. The An Elixir of Life quest is your ticket to getting up there, as you help out a university student. You buy a bottle of Elixir of Life from Melik, sell the bottle to Zara the student. She isn't finished though. She wants to test it against the hot spring water to prove that the elixir sold by Melik is fake. She has you fill up her 5 empty bottles with hot spring water from the 5 ponds in the world. Lastly, the hot air balloon, which has you painting Nessa in her hot air balloon and plastering a poster of that onto a populated location in Nava so she gets business. Afterwards, you can ride in the hot air balloon up to the mountain summit, where a hot spring is located. This is also a location for one of the mother paintings. That equals out to 7 quests, 8 if you count the Thief of Sinkwood Inn. In order to finally get to the top of the tower, where the last painting is, 7 separate quests need to be completed. The worst part of it all is the sealant ordeal, requiring the player to explore enough of the world to find the Mudwillow area and solve the mirror puzzle kills the pacing entirely. Now, it is definitely possible some people did her riddle before even knowing they needed to and never took issue with this. I figured there would be something here, but never would I have thought it would be required. I resorted to looking up where I had to go next, as at a certain point, you just can't do anything until you get the sealant. Nothing else on the entire island is available for you to complete until you access the Tifmore region. All of the commissioned paintings available to me were in that region. I already had 2 of the 4 mother paintings. I had purchased all of the items like the bike, zipline, and coat. I was wandering the island for hours trying to find any new quests or characters, but the solution was to randomly decide to figure out this mirror puzzle. This mirror puzzle is your gateway to finishing the game, even though it presents itself like an extra side quest. I can't overemphasize how much I dislike this progression path, especially considering I was never told this was necessary. Wandering the island aimlessly looking for a quest or some way to get the amulet made me realize that this island is just too big for its own good. There is a fast travel in the game from town to town, a clunky bicycle to drive, and zip lines to ride, but even still, you will need to do a lot of walking from place to place. What started out as relaxing began to get irritating. Maybe the island doesn't need to be as large as it currently is. I understand building a world that is spaced out appropriately enough so houses, rivers, and even trees can have enough space to breathe, but it almost seemed like making the world so large was to ensure players would get enough playtime out of Eastshade. The only video game I've ever found walking from place to place to be fun is Death Stranding. If Eastshade had those movement mechanics, my tone in this video would be very different. Instead, it's like nearly every other first-person walking simulator. Holding up on the control stick, hold the sprint button if the game provides one, and maybe turn the camera now and then. I could see this type of experience working with its current gameplay mechanics if its progression and island structure was tweaked a bit. Instead of a seemingly open world to explore, imagine if it was a more linear adventure from one side of the island to the other, with the same sort of themes, questlines, and gameplay. Your ship lands at the same place in Lindau, but the island is split up by two major rivers. Of course, the rivers would need to be much wider than they are now, as it breaks my immersion just looking at them. The bridges would have to be down for this to work, but riding around that issue wouldn't be that difficult. The struggle to finally get the raft might make more sense, as it would open up the next part of the game, where you wouldn't go back again right away. It would be an upgrade that represented moving on from a familiar area. The same thing would happen in the second segment of the island, only this time the Reedcraft boat is your end goal to survive the next, more dangerous river. You've come to appreciate and become familiar with another set of inhabitants, and you need to say goodbye again. After the final area, you need to travel across the island all the way back to the ship to finally go home. This would be a good replacement to the epilogue that currently exists. How it is now, you're in your room after you went home, with some letters from the people you've helped telling you updates on their lives. Imagine instead of how it exists now, on the trek back across the island, your return journey, you come across all of the people you previously encountered. The hot air balloon business has started picking up thanks to your help, and you can see a line of people waiting their turn. You find that the trails are a little more cleared out thanks to the park ranger bear. His partner came back, just like the note says, in the park ranger's home, and he excitedly shows you how well the water foxes are doing. The underworld guy is now taking some of his friends on tours of the surface. They still live underground, but are starting to understand and appreciate the surface world more and more. The apothecary bears have real customers at their shop. The junk trader took over for the lying potion salesman. The architect meets you before you depart the island for good, thanking you for your help. None of this is unrealistic. Most of what I'm suggesting is practically in the game already, just not focused on or resolved at a different time. Having 3 distinct areas could suit the game in other ways as well. Painting your mother's 4 favorite locations was your main goal, but only one of them ever felt like it was eventful, and that was largely due to how long it took you to accomplish. Getting to the top of this tower in Nava meant doing the quest line where you collect the 5 hot spring samples all across the island. You need to go to the Tiffmore Bluffs for 2 of them, but you also need to go over there for one of your mother paintings. For the final city painting, this area represented a part of a greater goal, but one of the paintings is literally just right there. So while you're in the middle of the closest thing this game has to a main quest line, you might as well paint the Tiffmore Bluffs, right? Like it was a small pit stop. It didn't feel as climactic as it probably should have. One of them you stumble on after you leave Lindau, the big tree. This one is simultaneously very good and very bad. It's nice that this tree is discoverable by you and not in the quest line, so it felt like you had some agency in this open world, but that's also why it kind of feels deflating. Walking over here and painting it with the already discussed lackluster painting mechanic felt emotionless. The best one is probably taking the hot air balloon ride up to the mountain. Unfortunately, there's a hot spring here too, so you may as well see this one as another pit stop in the Hot Springs quest. After you've actually painted the paintings, nothing really happens either. I think it would have been nice to hear a blurb from your mom, voice acted, talking about the location you just painted. Instead, it just feels like any other time you paint, you press a button and you're done. Even without the better painting mechanics or the voice lines from your mom that could have been added, these still would have been better suited with the 3 separated island idea I was talking about. The pacing of the paintings aren't terrible, but they don't have a sense of gravity to them. You just do it and move on. If there's not a reward in the form of engaging gameplay or lore voice lines from your mother, there at least ought to be a natural build-up framing the painting as the finale or culmination to an area. As much as I went on about not enjoying how the progress for the top of the tower painting was locked behind very specific tasks, that at least gave that particular painting some weight. It will undoubtedly be the player's last painting as well, unless they forgot to get the bluffs or the tree, which is unlikely. The tower painting provides that cathartic feeling that all of the paintings should offer. If you had 3 separate areas to explore individually, the mother paintings could have been the centerpiece, every quest in that location serving not only the people, but your goal of getting that painting. So instead of wandering back and forth trying to figure out which item you need to proceed, or finding underwhelming and nearly non-existent secrets of an open world that is frankly too big for its own good, you could have had a really nice 4-part structure. Opening area with Lindau, second area which could have been the Tifmore region, third area with Nava perhaps, and the final farewell tour. This would of course make the game more straightforward, but it would have cut down on the boring walking segments and help give you that sense of place by helping these people and only seeing resolutions later on when it would make sense to. The 4-part structure would give purpose to how much of a hassle it is to obtain the rafts, give the mother paintings a sense of climax that tops off each area, and evoke that feeling of saying goodbye that the game was attempting but missed the mark on with its drawn-out ending sequence. I don't usually suggest ways to improve the games I talk about, especially not to this degree, but I feel pretty confident about everything I said. The only drawback I could see is it wouldn't have the same open-world feel that some people might be looking for. However, I could argue that Eastshade itself doesn't even have that. To get over the bridge, you need to cough up 60 glowstones. To get into Nava, you need to get 3 references. And to access a very large amount of the island, you need to go through the Sealant quest rigmarole. The island is already split up in its own way, it just doesn't do anything with it. Ending on a sour note was inevitable when discussing Eastshade. The world is pretty to look at, but barren and devoid of meaningful content. There's no story to fall back on, the lore isn't as fleshed out as it really could have been, and the world feels artificial, especially in regards to the NPC routines. The quests range from pretty good, to meaninglessly short, to annoying and mandatory. The painting mechanics are uninspired, and besides fishing, the gameplay loop barely offers more than a traditional walking simulator. With all that being said, there is something to be hopeful about. There's no denying that the premise still excites me, even knowing that I would never want to play it again. Though it didn't always click with me personally, it certainly did with many others, as its Steam rating is at an 89% with a pretty sizable amount of reviews. I don't know if Eastshade Studios will attempt something like this in the future, but they certainly have a lot of people's attention, including my own. Even though I ended up not liking it as much as I wanted to, there was something here to gain my respect from a creative standpoint. As long as they don't venture off into strictly walking simulator territory, I will gladly give their next game a chance to win me over. Thanks for watching, everybody. We are now over 100 subscribers. Thank you so much for everyone who has subbed to the channel. The videos may slow down a bit compared to previous months, but I will still try to at least get 1 or 2 videos out a month. The next video should be on Dead Rising 2, but another potential candidate may jump the queue depending on how long it takes me. Like, comment, and subscribe on the video. Have a good one. I'll see you next time.